The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
The first F1 win for a V10 engine was somewhat overshadowed at the 1989 San Marino Grand Prix, thanks to Gerhard Berger surviving a fireball accident early on, and the war between Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna truly kicking off after this race. Those were just two of the many talking points in F1 at this early stage of the era we celebrate here on Bring Back V10s. And joining me, Glenn Freeman, to look back at the second race of 1989 are the two men who we always seem to turn to when we go back this far, Ed Straw and Sam Smith. Now, Sam, welcome to your first appearance of Series 4, so we'll come to you first. What's the first thing that comes to mind for you when you think back to Imola 89?
Well, as I haven't spoken to Ed for ages, it's got to be Nicola Larini's superb qualifying performance that got him 14th on the grid. But no, we'll come back to that in a dedicated Acela episode soon, I'm sure. But being serious, it's got to be that awful accident that befell Gerhard Berger. I mean, I can recall exactly where I was as a 14-year-old watching that with my dad having a TV Sunday roast, and my dad's going for a Burton as he sort of screamed at the TV to get Berger out of there and for the marshals to save him effectively. It was such a shocking thing to witness on a Sunday afternoon, and it sort of re-emphasized the peril, if you will, of F1 cars around a track like Imola, which was always pretty unforgiving at the best of times. So yeah, certainly one of those moments that sort of seems to slow down, and you always remember where you are when you see something as hideous as that, and thank goodness that Berger survived.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a lot more depth later on. Now, Ed, welcome along. Sam's obviously taken your Larini reference there, and I've got more bad news for you because there was initially a question about pre-qualifying that had made it into our running order, but I'm sorry to say that's been cut to save us some time. So aside from 8 cars setting times in pre-qualifying that would have got them into the race if they'd all made it through, what's your standout memory from this weekend?
Well, obviously, my interest had largely gone by the time pre-qualifying was finished on Friday morning, so it's a muddy memory. For the race, yeah, it's the Berger crash, but if you just say Imola 89 to me, then it's the Senna Prost tinderbox exploding, creating an era-defining rivalry, which I think we might get onto a little bit later in this podcast.
Yeah, it's fascinating, really, that a story where they didn't drive into each other is arguably one of their biggest fallings out, but we'll come to that much later on. Before we dive into the events of April 1989. Remember to get your questions in for our series finale episodes using the hashtag BringBackV10s on Twitter or email bringbackv10s@the-race.com. And if you want to get early access to ad-free versions of our new episodes, sign up to the Race Members Club, where you can get a range of other benefits as well. To find out more, head to the-race.com/members club. We'll start this episode in the same place we'll end it, and that's talking about McLaren. After winning 15 out of 16 races in 1988, McLaren had been defeated at the first attempt in 1989. That was primarily down to Senna getting caught up in a collision at the start in Brazil, and Prost suffering a clutch problem that meant he couldn't make another pit stop, so couldn't take on fresh tyres. But McLaren had other issues to iron out. The drivers weren't happy with the balance of the car or the throttle response from the normally aspirated Honda engine, so the team set to work on solving those problems during an 8-day test at Imola before this San Marino Grand Prix. By the time every team apart from Tyrrell turned up for what was meant to be a 3-day test, McLaren was already 5 days into its programme, which included Senna running a development version of the iconic MP44 from the previous year to try out a new gearbox and rear suspension. McLaren ended that test a terrifying 2.5 seconds faster than Nigel Mansell's Ferrari in third, but fortunately Mansell's surprise win in Rio had already ensured the Imola race weekend would be a sellout. So Sam, McLaren were hardly in crisis here, let's be honest. The car was quick. Senna was on pole by 8 tenths in Brazil. But by turning a 3-day test into an 8-day test, was that just a sign of the level McLaren was operating at compared to everybody else in this era?
I don't think that sort of attention to detail was uncommon from McLaren in the late 80s and early 90s. I mean, an 8-day test, that's probably exhausted Tyrrell's yearly budget straight away, hasn't it? But what you've got to remember is that in 89, it was the first season of running the Atmo car, and there had been some glitches in testing, and then at Rio, it hadn't been a particularly smooth weekend for them. So it was in all-out sort of a maximum attack mode to a large degree anyway. The previous season had shown that McLaren was essentially operating at a different level. And I recall attending a few tests myself with my father in 89. We had a family friend who worked for McLaren. And I just recall seeing in the back of the garages these banks of computers, which now would look a bit chunky and outdated, I guess. But then it was otherworldly. You know, this was a completely new way of going racing. You didn't see anything like that outside of Star Trek or Tomorrow's World, something for the 80s kids there. So I guess even via the TV, watching on TV, you got a sense that Senna and Prost were right at the cutting edge, and McLaren were at the cutting edge of a really progressive team. When you look at the arsenal of talent that was behind the scenes as well, I mean, Gordon Murray, Steve Nichols, Neil Oatley, Dave Ryan, Osamu Goto, who was running the Honda program, of course, they were all controlled by Ron Dennis, and even sort of what you call senior middle management, such as Crichton Brown, had a lot of experience, and they were just bringing the team into a completely different operating window to anyone else on the grid at that stage. So really, they just seemed completely impossible to beat in that era. That's my defining memory of how McLaren was operating at that time.
And probably all that computing power you saw in the back of the garage was less powerful than one of our phones that we've got today. But elsewhere in F1 at this time, there was a bizarre situation where Yamaha felt compelled to deny stories that its F1 engine program was actually an undercover mission for Toyota. This was fueled by commercial ties between the two companies away from racing. Yamaha was developing road car engines for Toyota at the time, but it didn't make cars of its own. So this led people to question what it was getting out of a Formula One program with Zaxbyed at the time. Yamaha's senior managing director, Takahito Hasegawa, addressed the speculation about links with Toyota, saying, F1 is the top of what's possible with engines, so it was natural that we would want to come into it. Even though we don't make cars, we want to show the world that Yamaha makes engines that are reliable. For the moment, we don't think big. We'd like to be a small group, but with big technology. Now, Ed, the Yamaha name stuck around in F1 until the late 90s, but did it ever really make sense that they had an F1 engine but no road cars to sell?
It certainly made it an outlier among the engine manufacturers, but Yamaha made it quite clear that its F1 objective was to acquire technical knowledge. That was the phrase that was very often appearing in the literature it put out. Yeah, Yamaha wasn't selling cars, but it was making plenty of engines, so yeah, logical from that perspective. They did actually try to produce a high-end road car on the back of the F1 project, but never got past the prototype phase and was a bit of a flop. So yeah, Yamaha Corporation, a pretty diverse company in terms of its output, so I guess they just like the idea of enhancing their technology that way. It did have that relationship with Toyota that you mentioned. It was also had some partnerships with Ford, etc. So, real engine manufacturer. So I'm sure F1 on paper made sense. On track, it made less sense, as the results ultimately showed. I don't doubt that there was some kind of dialogue with Toyota. It makes sense. They had a very long-standing connection, those two companies. But I think it's massively overstating it to consider the Yamaha F1 project some kind of stalking horse for Toyota.
I wonder if it helped them sell any pianos as well. But Ed, let's make your day nice and early in this episode because we have a legitimate reason to talk about Gabriele Tarquini. The Italian was confirmed before this race as the full season replacement at AGS for Philippe Streff, who'd suffered horrible injuries in a testing crash in Brazil ahead of the season. We'll talk about Streff in more detail when we do a Brazil 89 episode in the future, but by the time of Imola, the update on his condition was that he was now breathing without difficulty and beginning to regain some feeling in his arms in hospital in France. So Ed, let's look at Tarquini, as you always do in every day of your life. He already had a handful of F1 starts to his name and plenty of failures to pre-qualify in 1988 with Coloni. But was this AGS chance a better opportunity to show what he could really do?
Yeah, for a short time, definitely. Even if AGS was a team that was in a near permanent state of flux for reasons far too lengthy to go into. Here, they had a carryover car from 88, so it worked reasonably well. Tarquini actually qualified pretty reliably for the first half dozen races. There is quite a big asterisk against that in that he was in the AGS that didn't have to get through pre-qualifying, and Joe Winkelhock in the other car didn't get through pre-qualifying ever, basically. But Tarquini made the most of it, loitered around the points quite often during that run towards the end of the race. He's got 6th place in Mexico, 13th on the grid in Monaco, but yeah, never escaped, never did enough to avoid dropping into pre-qualifying the second half of the year. And AGS, because it was in such a tricky situation, didn't really build on that. And then once, of course, they were in pre-qualifying, had Goodyear tyres, which didn't work so well in pre-qualifying. And you had Tarquini going from being a point scorer, picking up 1 point, and being a little bit unlucky, actually, not to pick up a couple more, to just never pre-qualifying in the second half of the season. So it actually created this very brief half dozen or so races that were the highlight of Tarquini's career. So a short but beneficial uplift, but it all went a little bit Coloni as the season went on.
Yeah, and if you want to hear much more about why pre-qualifying was so bonkers and sometimes so unfair, head back to Series 1, where we basically let Ed live in dreamland for just over an hour and just discuss all the random stories and backmarkers that were in that era. But let's move on to another subject that I think is going to be quite fun, because in the news in April 1989 was the Birmingham Super Prix, which by this point had become an established F3000 event. But the local authorities in Birmingham had set their sights higher than that, and they were seeking an act of parliament to allow the event to expand to 4 days. The short-term goal was to get the F3000 event expanded to 3 days, but Les Collins, Birmingham City Council's chief executive, said that because legislation was so expensive, it made sense to get the application for a 4-day event in at the same time for what he called the long-term ambition of hosting a Grand Prix. Now, Sam, you love a bit of F3000, so I'm sure you know the Super Prix well from its brief run in the late 80s. What would an F1 race on those streets of Birmingham have been like? Would it have been brilliant or ridiculous?
Brilliantly ridiculous, I reckon. Having attended the 1990 race in a working capacity as a spotty work experience kid for a team, I can almost still hear the resonance of those engines bouncing off the buildings in Birmingham. It was a fantastic event. It was a terrific circuit, actually, and challenging. That amazing double back straight down Belgrave Middleway. It was a fast street circuit, and yet safety may have been marginal, to say the very least. There were some apocalyptic 3000 shunts. I mean, David Hunt famously took a chunk out of a brick wall in 88. Fabrizio Barbaza had this most extraordinary cartwheeling incident when he launched off the back of Eddie Irvine and sort of went in the general direction of Edgbaston Cricket Ground. I mean, on paper, it sounds fanciful to say that Birmingham could have hosted a Grand Prix in those early days, but when you look at the likes of Adelaide or Detroit or Phoenix from that era, I wouldn't say Birmingham was any less able to host a race or was any less of a challenge. And it kind of had elements of reminding one of Adelaide in some respects. It was quick, and it had lots of overtaking opportunities. I think the big issue will have been the pits and the paddock infrastructure, which, if I remember correctly, was located on the forecourt of Bristol Street Motors car dealership, which was a bit novel. And I think I may have recalled Sir Jackie Stewart trying to flog some Ford Scorpios down there. Actually, I'm not sure, but anyway, when you look back at the UK then, it was dovetailing between Brands Hatch and Silverstone, wasn't it, until 86, and then Silverstone was revamped in 91. So there was always going to be a limited chance of another track coming up on the rails and snatching it from those two. So, but we can dream, can't we? I don't think it got particularly close, but it's fairly tantalising when you think about F1 cars round there. And I don't think it is ridiculous to say that you could have had a really good Grand Prix there.
And it's more real than any London Grand Prix plans have ever been. At least the circuit existed and hosted high-level racing. But let's move on. Dennis Jenkinson in Motorsport magazine was critical of the teams that weren't yet running their definitive 1989 cars by the second race of the season. A handful of teams, including Benetton, March, Minardi and Coloni, were still running their 1988 cars, while Tyrrell would have only one new car for Imola. And Williams would spend most of the year running a version of its 1988 FW12 adapted to take the Renault V10 engine. Jenks wrote, "The object of any serious team should be to have its new cars ready for the first race of the season, especially if the season is to be for a new formula." McLaren, Honda and Ferrari achieved this in spite of the fact that they were racing turbocharged cars right through to the end of 1988. Every race you miss with your new car puts you that far behind the opposition, especially the successful ones who win the races. While all the late panic and sweat, which was used to describe teams rushing to get new cars ready, seemed commendable, you have to admire the front-running teams who were ready to go from the first day of practice of the first race. So, Ed, we'll come to some of the individual situations behind these teams running older cars shortly. But we're used to now teams coming out of a new car every season in the modern era. If you ignore the carryover year we're in at the moment, it's been a long time since any top teams would carry a chassis over as they used to. Looking back, though, to 1989, F1 was a different world back then. Was this criticism of a handful of teams for carrying their cars over really fair?
To a point, as clearly it would be preferable to have a new car ready for the start of the year. But it's a point I often make when we're talking about this kind of period. This was a transitional phase for Formula One, and even for a few more years, this would remain relatively common. Even a few occasions early in the 21st century, and Ferrari carried over its car for the first few races. So this rhythm of new cars for the start of the year wasn't quite as well established, and teams were often, well, always compared to today, smaller and, relatively speaking, more amateurish. That sounds like I'm slating them, but just compared to what we see today, amateurish in terms of the processes, etc. You could sometimes get an advantage as well from carrying over a car early in a season, provided that car's fast enough. The point about the new formula, I think, is maybe where Jenks is being missing a little bit of the context, because, yeah, teams like McLaren and Ferrari did have to do new cars, but the vast majority of teams effectively were running to the new rules in 88, because almost everyone, with a few exceptions, were running normally aspirated cars. So while there's something to the criticism, I think to call this a new formula as a criticism of the carrying over of cars isn't necessarily quite fair. But obviously, big picture, yeah, and as time went on, teams did more regularly do this. But as some teams found, you could gain an advantage from it, as AGS indeed did.
The 1989 cars from March and Benetton were already testing by this point, but they weren't considered ready to race yet. Williams' FW13 would come out for the final 4 races of the year and then race into 1990 as well. So it spent almost the entire 1989 season racing with what it called a C-spec version of its car from the previous year. Thierry Boutsen joined the team from Benetton, and he said the FW12C only had one setup that worked, and that was to run it as stiff as possible, which didn't make it great to drive. Patrick Head said Williams should have made a better car in 1989, adding, "In truth, we carried forward the FW12 that we'd done for the Judd engine. Integrating a completely new engine is quite a lot of work." Williams would win 2 races in the wet with Boutsen in this season. And as I say, the second of those wins would be with the FW13 in Adelaide. But Ed, looking at Williams, this was only 2 seasons after they dominated both championships in 1987 with their final year with Honda power. Given this was the first year of their new partnership with Renault, should they have been more ambitious than just going, right, let's just get the Renault engine in the back of the 88 car?
Yeah, well, if Patrick Head thinks so, then who am I to argue? It was certainly strange because Williams had a reasonable run-up to 89 in terms of that Renault deal. It was announced in, I think, June the previous year. A Renault-engined Williams first ran in October. But there was also quite a bit of distraction going on with the FW13. There was an active ride project that they shelved for that car, and there were wind tunnel changes going on. So I get the impression of a team that's not chaotic, but I'm not sure that all the processes were in place for thinking everything through in the right way. The FW12C wasn't too bad. They did make a reasonable amount of changes to it. It had to be a lot longer to fit the Renault engine in, suspension tweaks, lightweight gearbox, lots of cooling changes as a result of the engine, and limited in its setup window, but it worked. It wasn't too bad. Patrese managed to stick it on pole in Hungary, but it does seem odd for a team like Williams not to pull out all the stops in trying to produce the best possible car. But the FW13 itself wasn't particularly brilliant, so I'm not sure that would have really helped. And given the trajectory they were on, Williams and Renault were going to achieve great things a few years down the line. Perhaps it was the right step, and it was just a necessary interim year or two they had to go through on the way to becoming the team of the first half of the 90s.
As we mentioned earlier, Tyrrell got one of its new 018 cars to Imola, giving it to lead driver Michele Alboreto, who was on home soil in Italy that weekend. The car was considered a big step forward aerodynamically to its predecessor, which Jonathan Palmer would be stuck with this weekend. But remarkably, Alboreto failed to qualify 1 year on from racing here in a Ferrari. He was one of 3 ex-Ferrari drivers to fail to make the grid, along with Stefan Johansson and René Arnoux for Onyx and Ligier respectively. Palmer did manage to qualify with the old car, and this was despite Tyrrell bringing the wrong rear wing for it, meaning he had too much downforce and therefore too much drag down the straights. Shortly after Alboreto was bumped out by Yannick Dalmas in the closing seconds of qualifying, Tyrrell quickly took the decision to switch Palmer into the new car for the race to at least turn it into a bit of a test session. And let's quickly hear another tale or two about what was going on behind the scenes with the new car that weekend from Tyrrell engineer Nigel Beresford, who spoke to Sam about it.
Michele, and he was a lovely, lovely guy, really lovely guy, but he wasn't entirely happy. For example, he drove the 018 for its first race he was down to drive it for its first race at Imola. But we finished the car literally sort of 2 o'clock in the morning, and all of the practice and qualifying sessions were taken up with debugging it. And as I say, I remember it was crazy. I mean, in Tyrrell's own very carry-on way, we were doing things in the garage in the middle of the night at Imola. Like Harvey wanted to check on the roll stiffness distribution of the car. So he figured out that one of our truckies weighed about 100 kilograms. So he had this guy hanging off the side of the car, holding onto the rollover hoop, whilst he took corner weight scale measurements to try and understand how the roll stiffness was distributed on the car. It was a sort of crazy, wild, wacky thing that Harvey would do, but which also made him so much fun to be around. But at that Imola race, Michele didn't qualify. Palmer somehow dragged the turgid old 017B into the race, and would, because of a quirk of the rules, was allowed to change car and actually race the 018. So started the race. Berger had his massive accident. Palmer said he'd had terrible understeer during the first part of the race, so we hooked up the bar, and hey presto, it lit the thing up, and I think he finished 5th or whatever in that race. He certainly drove a great race, and all of a sudden, all of the promise of the new era with Harvey and Jean-Claude started to come true.
Sam, I think that's a great insight Nigel gave you there into how ramshackle even the midfield of F1 could be in this era. But looking at Alboreto, any sympathy for him for failing to make the grid with a brand new car?
I think there were some majorly affecting circumstances in that first race for the 018. It hadn't turned a wheel prior to arriving in Imola, and then he was compromised by a wet first qualifying on the Friday, and then he also got stranded out at Piratella after an issue with the car. I think it was a fuel pump issue. that he had and lost a load of laps there too. But still, he couldn't get it together for whatever reason on Saturday and lost out by less than a tenth to Dalmas's Lola. I just, when you were reading that out, Glenn, who else hadn't qualified, I wonder if it's the only time in F1 history that 3 ex-Ferrari drivers were in the DNQ bracket with Rennie Arnaud, Stefan Johansson and Alboreto. That's quite a curious one, isn't it, for a quiz sometime? But I suppose when you consider that Alboreto had been feted by the Tifosi at Monza just 6 months prior to this race at Imola, this rather ignominious DNQ must have been really hard to take for him. And there's no wonder he was pretty hacked off. In fact, it was Alboreto's first DNQ since he raced for Tyrrell first time round at Hockenheim in 1981. So, yeah, not a great time for him. But and again, it must have stung a little bit and put some salt in the wounds when Palmer took the car to 6th place just 24 hours later. But it still did come good for Michele at Monaco. He got 5th at Monaco and then a podium in the next race at Mexico before that rather murky estrangement from the team a little later in the summer. But yeah, I think it all came down to that Saturday qualifying, and I think the lack of laps in that car in qualifying trim just counted against him.
One man who cut it surprisingly fine to get into this race was Johnny Herbert, who'd started 10th and finished 4th on his F1 debut last time out in Brazil. But Herbert was having a tough time of things at Imola with the injuries he'd suffered in his massive F3000 crash the year before. We won't talk about how his little stint with Benetton went in general, as we covered that in detail in our France 89 episode, because that was when Johnny was dropped. But Herbert had some interesting stuff to say about the Imola weekend in his book, so we will look at that. Johnny said, if you search the meaning of the phrase false dawn on the internet, one of the first results you're bound to see is the start of Johnny Herbert's F1 career. Back in the spring of 1989, I had no idea the walls were about to fall in. My Achilles heel was breaking, although I didn't accept this at first. In Rio, because of the way the track was laid out, I didn't have to brake a great deal, and in many cases I was able to use the gears. This meant that although I found it difficult, I didn't hear any alarm bells ringing, or if I did, I was just ignoring them. The next race at Imola was a bit of a disaster, and that was partly down to my attitude. I went over there thinking, this is a doddle, I'll just turn up and get myself in the points again. I didn't have the right attitude for a full Formula 1 season, failed to prepare, and you prepare to fail. Herbert did nearly score points again, running as high as 6th in a race, but he spun late on at Tosa and then completed what I can only describe as one of the worst rejoin attempts I've ever seen in F1, where he tries to spin the car around to rejoin and basically drive straight across the track into the gravel. Not Johnny's finest work, but he jokes now that he should have retired on race morning after he received a round of applause in the driver's briefing from the other drivers, which was initiated by FISA President Jean-Marie Balestre in acknowledgement of his result in Brazil. So Ed, after the highs of Rio, how much of a wake-up call was this weekend for Herbert?
It was certainly the start of the process of him really coming to terms with how much trouble I think he was in, because that Brazil result was a miracle. But I think it took him quite a long time to realise how much his career and even his life, because it still affects him to this day, would be affected by that accident. Obviously, he understands it writing in his book, but that's with the benefit of plenty of time to understand it, have the whole career and think about it for a bit. So, yeah, I think at this point you've got a Johnny Herbert who's being confronted with some of the problems and trying to get his head around it, shall we say. But he'd done that important job in Brazil of showing he could broadly still do it. But I suspect Imola wasn't necessarily the lowest point, as we talk about later on. As we talked about previously on Bring Back V10s, it didn't go so well with Benetton in the end. And again, it comes down to the fact that with Johnny Herbert's whole career, what he did after that accident was a minor miracle. To win 3 Grand Prix and have the career he did doesn't really make a great deal of sense. And you can't just help but wonder what a fully fit Herbert would have done in that car. It's one of those unanswerable questions. I think even he can't answer that. But as he said, he was always a driver that struggled with braking. That's why he was a better racer than qualifier. But yeah, it's the start of the wake-up call, but I think that was quite a long process.
Let's get to the race then, because behind the all-McLaren front row led by Senna, Mansell was the best of the rest in third, 1.6 seconds back, and Patrese Williams in fourth was the only other car within 2 seconds of pole. Berger and Boutsen lined up on row 3, with Alessandro Nannini's Benetton and Nelson Piquet's Lotus completing a top 8 that was covered by 3 seconds. The start of the race was largely uneventful, although we'll come back to why that was in a moment. Then at the start of the 4th lap, we had the terrifying sight Sam described earlier of Berger's Ferrari going straight on at Tamburello, slamming into the concrete wall and then sliding along the grass until it eventually came to rest and burst into flames. Now, Sam, we've already touched on this briefly, but it's not over-dramatising this to say that it looked like we could be witnessing a fatal accident here.
Yeah, it was completely appalling. I mean, just the impact itself looked devastating. Then there was that eerie split second before the flash fire consumed what was left of the wreck. And, you know, when you look back at it and you listen to it, it even caught Murray Walker by, well, not just by surprise, but just the devastation of the situation that he had to commentate on live to the likes of me and my old man sat having our Sunday dinner. So it was horrendous. A few years ago, I did quite a detailed piece on this weekend and Berger's accident. And I actually tracked down the fire marshals that saved Berger that day. They became known as the Lions of Imola, and I think they deserve a mention and to be named, actually. They were Paolo Verdi, Bruno Miniati, and Gabriele Vivoli. And the standard marshal's post at the exit of Tamburello was called 3C. They all had a consolidated intervention strategy not to get in each other's way if there was a serious accident such as Berger's. And the distance between the site of the crash, or where Berger came to rest on fire, and Marshal's Post 3C was later measured at 87 metres. But despite the considerable distance that Vivoli had to get to, he started emptying his extinguisher on the fire just 14.5 seconds after the Ferrari had come to a halt, which, when you think about it, is remarkable. And he was running towards the accident before it had actually ignited, before Berger had come to a stop. So massive respect for what they did that day. But even after it, the fire was extinguished and there was no movement from the cockpit, there just seemed so little chance that Berger could have survived that accident, that the impact and obviously then the fire, without being gravely injured. And Miniati told me actually that he remembered seeing Berger after the, or just as the fire was being dissipated, seeing Berger's helmet bubbling in the heat. He actually saw that, which is just absolutely horrendous. So, a massive effort to save him, and thankfully it did. But a complete miracle that he got out of that.
I think the thing that's often forgotten, you mentioned the size of the initial impact. It's very, very difficult to see how badly damaged the structure of the car is because they start cutting it about to get Berger out. But there's a few points where you can see how much damage there is and how exposed Berger actually is. That's the thing that always amazes me about that crash. Everyone talks about the fire, and with good reason, but it's amazing he was still in play without some proper serious injuries even before the fire started.
Yeah, there are a couple of incredible images from a photographer who was stationed very close to where the car came to a stop. And you get a much better, when you see those photos, if you Google them, you get a much better idea for the dynamics of this crash and how, as Ed said there, how exposed Berger was, how the car had started to break up around him, and how he even ended up on its side. I'm not sure, Sam, if it rolled entirely, but there was a lot more going on here than just a car ploughing into a wall and then coming to a rest, wheels up and bursting into flames.
Yeah, those images are extraordinary, actually. The chassis, the monocoque broke on the right side, and the image shows the car kind of leaning at an angle, as you described, and Berger's torso completely exposed and kind of flailing around in it. Thankfully, the belts kept him to the bulkhead of the car. But when you consider the violence of that impact against what was a concrete wall, I mean, we're so used to Tech Pro now, aren't we? Or at the weekend with Verstappen hitting some tires is bad enough, but that was a solid concrete wall which was placed because beyond it was a bank going down to the Santerno River. So it had to be a pretty forceful barrier from that perspective. But to actually have that accident, when you look at the amount or the lack of grass runoff, there was no gravel, there was no high density tarmac, of course, in those days. It was just grass, and whether the grass was damp or whether it was parched through the sun, it wasn't going to check much momentum. So when you consider that Berger would have been approaching that corner at 100, and let's say conservative estimate would have been 185 miles an hour, I reckon he probably scribbed off 20 or 25 before he hit the wall. So to have an impact, even though it was quite a shallow angle, it was no wonder that the monocoque fractured, because again, remember that this was still the pioneering days of composite technology. So I think we'll come on to the fact that John Barnard was involved in the design of that car, and how much that influenced the survival of Berger a bit later. But certainly that was all contributing to thankfully him being able to survive such a horrendous accident.
Yeah, at the time, Berger described it as an accident no one should have survived. He's since recalled the accident in great detail on a few occasions, and a couple of years ago he did so on the F1 Beyond the Grid podcast with Tom Clarkson that we like to give shout-outs to here. And in that he said when he got to the hospital and went over all the thoughts he had from the crash, he assumed the runoff must have been huge because he had so much time to think about it before it happened. He said he'd noticed the right front wheel had popped up in the air, so he thought, what's happened here? And then he checked his rear tyres in the mirrors because he thought he must have a puncture. But they looked fine, and he still had time to think about how bad the angle was going to be. And by the time he hit the wall, then he said, shortly before the impact, I thought it's better to put your hands away from the steering wheel, and that's what I did. I put them on my shoulders and waited for the big bang. Berger has admitted in pretty much every interview he's ever given about this crash, including those straight after he came out of hospital, that he was in so much pain in the ambulance, he vowed never to race again because he thought you don't get away with many accidents like that. But an hour or two later, he'd already changed his mind. Sam, given what we've discussed around this accident, could even a driver considered as tough as Gerhard Berger be forgiven if he had quit on the spot that day?
Absolutely, he could have been forgiven. You know, I consider Berger's career as two parts, really, pre-Imola 89 and post-Imola 89. Prior to the shunt, he had that lunatic element in him for sure. I mean, he was incredibly quick, but he did take remarkable chances. I mean, if you've never seen it, check out Hockenheim in 1988 when he elects to keep his foot planted to the gas while taking Eddie Cheever on the link straight back to the stadium. It must have been 200 miles an hour, and he spins the car, and it's only a miracle chance that he doesn't have a major accident on that occasion. So he'd had some of the cards already going for him in incidents such as that, and there were several more. So after Imola in 89, he still kind of had that devil may care attitude, but it was diluted to a reasonable degree, I think. And there's little surprise in that, I guess, when he'd been through that kind of trauma. He turned up at Monaco just 2 weeks later after the accident and wandered the paddock with heavily bandaged hands, which were pretty badly burnt, actually. He had a broken rib and I think a cracked shoulder blade as well. I think in the context of what we saw with Romain Grosjean's shunt last season, that there's no way that Berger should have even raced at Mexico City, which was just a month later. But as you know, as we often say, times were very different back then. I think there are two things that saved Berger from a psychological point of view that day at Imola. Firstly, it was his kind of natural irreverent demeanor, which he's always had in him, in his character, which seems to ensure that he doesn't take life too seriously. You know, he's noted for his character traits from that department. The second is that he doesn't actually remember the fire, which was a blessing, wasn't it? I mean, he was knocked out in the impact and then woke up, as you said, Glenn, in the ambulance. That means he had no recollection of being trapped or immersed in the fire, which of course would have been completely traumatic. There are some extraordinary photos, as we mentioned, and I think, you know, when he subsequently looked back at them, it must have been interesting to him because, like I said, he was unconscious and then was brought round by the doctors. It's one of the fascinating aspects of racing drivers, isn't it, that they can return to the cockpit after these hideous shunts. And in Berger's case, I think it would have all seemed like it had happened to someone else to some extent. At the time, he lost consciousness anyway in that sort of critical part of the accident. So the real challenge came when he was recuperating in hospital a few days and weeks afterwards before he went back and saw the cars in action at Monaco. So, yeah, there's a lot of processes to go through there. But I think Berger's character traits, going back to them, I think that certainly helped him get back on the horse, as they say.
Yeah, I think his first memory in the aftermath of the crash is vaguely sort of waking up and having Sid Watkins on top of him trying to get an airway into him. But Berger's change of heart about stopping on the spot was helped by the fact that he'd been cleaned up at the hospital, and his fears that he'd sustained burns all over his body turned out not to be the case. He did have bad burns to his hands, and this was partly because he'd cut the Nomex out of the inside of his gloves to get a better feel for the steering wheel. But fortunately for 1989, he'd made the decision to start wearing another layer of fireproofs under his overalls rather than a Marlboro t-shirt as he'd been doing up to then. But the rest of the pain he'd been feeling on his skin was just because he was covered in what he called aggressive fuel that was being used at the time. As well as F1 using what I think we can quite safely call Larry fuel concoctions at this time, the fuel tanks themselves were already in the spotlight, with the smaller turbo engines being replaced by bigger engines with more cylinders for 1989. Teams running V10 or V12 engines had been reluctant to extend their wheelbase out of fear of losing chassis stiffness, so the fuel tanks were being pushed outwards and around the side of the drivers. More stringent protection and crash testing, including the fuel tank, had already been put forward as part of a raft of rule changes agreed by the new F1 Design Commission that weekend, but this accident just put it further into the spotlight. Ed, fuel tanks spread out and coming around the driver, should that ever have been allowed in the first place?
Simple answer, no. There had been some rules in the past forcing the fuel tank to be behind the driver, but I think at this stage, as long as they were within the structure of the car, it was allowed. But obviously, as we explained, the structure of the car quite rapidly dismantled itself on impact, which caused the problem. So yeah, the geometries that you're allowed to use and the place you could put the fuel bladders were changed in the rules in the future. And I think this is the last time that a fuel tank in F1 has actually ruptured. We've had fuel outside of the fuel tank, and in the Grosjean crash, it got outside of the fuel tank because of the way the hatch disconnected. But I think the fuel bladder itself was intact after the impact. So that was a sensible rule change. And yeah, I imagine there's quite a few drivers after Berger's crash who have reason to be thankful for the way things changed, because fire became so rare. Although with that fuel around, it's always possible, as Romain Grosjean demonstrated recently.
Let's move on to two other key men affected by this accident and what went through their minds, and that's car designer John Barnard and Berger's teammate Nigel Mansell. We'll start with Barnard because this was his car. Talking about the crash in his book, which is excellent, he said, "I went cold. I was horrified at the thought that I might have killed a driver. He was on fire. I was shaken, and I'd already made up my mind. If he had died, I was out of the business. I would have quit on the spot." The cause of the crash was a broken front wing, which Barnard said had snapped upwards, probably because Berger had been hitting the curbs. But Barnard said it was his fault, as he'd only calculated the strength of the wing mounting based on resisting the downward push of aerodynamic force, not considering if it could withstand an upward shock. And those were Barnard's words. He also blamed a rule change that deemed flexible front wing end plates to be illegal, as he said that made the wings too stiff and put more pressure on the mounting. But ultimately, he said the miscalculation was his mistake. However, Berger, to this day, is grateful to Barnard, and he has since said, "That car saved my life because John made it so strong and safe." So, Sam, is Barnard being a bit tough on himself here, particularly given that Berger was probably saved by sitting in a carbon fibre monocoque, which Barnard had pioneered earlier in the decade with McLaren?
Yeah, I think so to some extent, because ultimately the tub clearly went a long way to saving Gerhard's life that day. And you have to remember that, again, as I said before, in the late 80s, composites knowledge was still developing. It was only a year later, wasn't it, when Martin Donnelly had his career-ending accident, or his top-line career-ending accident at Jerez. And if you see what happened in that accident with the complete disintegration of the survival cell, you look at how brittle those cars were, and if you hit the wrong angle and you went off at the wrong place, which Donnelly certainly did, then anything could happen. And I think that an engineer's biggest fear, as Barnard attested, is something of their control contributing to an accident to begin with, and that appeared to be the case to some extent here with that rule change, and the fact that the wing actually broke at the root, or at the mounting point of the front wing. So miscalculations do happen, but when they have their roots in a rules change anyway, then I think there's some mitigating factors and circumstances there. The interesting part of it was that Barnard had been such a pioneer of the composites design revolution. So I guess that when you have a shunt of that magnitude in any car, then having one in a Barnard car, and the way that has been laminated, and the way that it has been finite element and analysed, which kind of came on a bit later into the 90s, but was done to some degree pre-CATIA, the design system that was used on race cars in the 90s in particular, then I think actually the fact that Berger says that the car saved his life is true, but you can understand why Barnard was self-critical to the extent of worrying that his mistake had caused the accident in the first place. So I'd say that it was a good outcome to a bad situation, obviously, that developed with a lot of different circumstances in the accident itself.
Let's move on to Mansell then. In his book that was released in the mid-90s, he said thinking about that day at Imola still gave him goosebumps. He'd not seen the accident as it happened behind him, but when he did, he was horrified. Mansell said things were heated in the Ferrari pits as the team had to decide if he could take the restart, despite not knowing at that point what caused Berger's accident. Mansell said he felt better once he'd seen Berger and knew that his life wasn't in danger. Nigel wrote, as I made my way back to the motorhome, people were talking to me, but I didn't see them or hear them. I do recall running into James Hunt, who said there was no way I should drive as it was too dangerous. I went inside the motorhome and it was like a madhouse. All kinds of wild things were being said, and in the middle of it all, Barnard was being put under this impossible pressure. I couldn't listen to any more of that, so I came away and made the decision that I would restart. I knew it was very risky, given that we didn't know why Gerhard had crashed, but from what I had heard, I felt that if I didn't give Barnard the vote of confidence, then the team would suffer in the long term. I don't feel particularly brave, although I might well have thought someone else stupid for doing the same thing. You just have to judge the situation as it appears to you and let your instincts guide you. And Barnard has said that Mansell came up to him and said, tell me it's okay and I'm back in the car and away. And Barnard told him, as far as I know, there isn't a problem with the car. It's okay. Mansell did take the restart and he admitted he was relieved when his gearbox failed after 23 laps. Ed, is a scenario like that for team and driver, is that a situation where there's no right answer, basically?
Unfortunately, although very, very occasionally there can be, if you do understand exactly what's happened, usually you don't have the time or the data available to really know what's gone on, so you can just go on probabilities. So, yeah, all Barnard could do is give his honest appraisal that there was nothing, as far as he knew, that was fundamentally wrong that caused it. Ultimately, it falls on the driver, doesn't it? And more often than not, we do see the driver takes the risk. Drivers are quite good at disconnecting the little bit of their brain that contains the memory of the crash when they're in the car. But Mansell, to his credit, did also engineer in a little bit of a margin in the way he was driving, both at Tamburello and in terms of the way he attacked the curbs. There's some quite vicious curbs, quite steep curbs at Imola at that time. So I think Mansell was right to do that. And obviously, as we know, there was the problem with the wing, the way it failed. And in fact, even after they'd strengthened it, I think Mansell had a similar failure at Monaco with nothing like the same consequences. So, yeah, there was a risk. So perhaps Mansell was right to be relieved. But it was clear that the failure would only happen when it was pretty heavily loaded and there were some big spike loads going through it. So, yeah, there is no right answer. But, of course, Mansell was going to race, wasn't he? Because he's Nigel Mansell.
On to the restart then, and at the front, Prost got the better start and beat Senna off the line this time, only for Senna to retake the lead on the run down to Tosa. Prost was incensed by this, as he felt Senna had broken an agreement they had not to race each other on the run down to the first braking zone of the lap, an agreement Prost had respected on the first start when it was Senna that had got away in the lead. He hounded Senna throughout the race until making a very uncharacteristic error and spinning at the final chicane with 12 laps to go, just after he'd set the fastest lap. Speaking in the book Senna vs. Prost by Malcolm Foley, which we'll quote quite a lot from this point on, Prost said, "I was much quicker than Senna through this race, but I couldn't drive well. I drove one of my worst races. I was so furious. When I came in second, I saw Senna smiling, and all I felt was anger." I have to say, Prost didn't look that angry on the podium. If you look at the footage, he's actually laughing when Senna's struggling to pop the cork on his champagne bottle. But after the podium, Prost stormed off, skipping the post-race press conference and picking up a $5,000 fine for that. Sam, before we get on to the broken agreement, how many other Alain Prost spins in a Grand Prix can you think of? Because of all of this, that was perhaps the most un-Prost thing that happened this day.
Yes, it was. I mean, an angry Prost. Whenever did we see an angry Prost? Not very often. And there weren't many errors, as you say. Monaco 82, when he pinballed it off the barriers after the chicane. Interlagos 93. I mean, they were weather affected as well. So Imola actually seems to have been the place where he did make some errors. 1991, he spun on the formation lap when in his first home race, in that race, and then obviously Berger went off as well. But again, that was some circumstances maybe beyond his control. This seems to be a race where it was just a rare instance of Prost not being able to build a race, which is the most un-Prost-like thing that you can think of, isn't it? The spin was really just, I suppose, a legacy, I think, of that anger, and no doubt in his mind already was the perceived Senna treachery, which we'd seen at Tosa. And actually, although completely different, I can see some similarities to what we've begun to witness with Verstappen and Hamilton now, in the sense that there was this feeling of inevitability, wasn't there, about Senna and Prost? They'd had a generally cordial 88, although there were some flashpoints, as mentioned, particularly at Estoril. But at the beginning of that season, 89, there was this brewing sense of that there were going to be some more clashes, and it built up to a crescendo, of course, at Suzuka at the end of the season. But in the race itself, Prost he got a little bit compromised by back markers. I mean, remember, this was before the blue flag nannying that we get now, so it was a different thing then. He was especially compromised by Thierry Boutsen, who was running in fourth place at that time, and then he had his spin on lap 47, cost him 8 seconds, and it just became a snowball effect that really the race was out of his control, which I think for somebody like Prost, and even people watching him and his team, would have been completely nonplussed about, because it was just such a rarity from somebody who was perceived to be the professor and the master. So yeah, all very un-Prost-like, but the ripples from that so-called broken agreement, I think, really just exacerbated his frustration during the race.
I bet Senna thought, job done. Angry Prost, spinning, not coming to the press conference, brilliant.
Yeah, and we'll come back to Senna's side of the story in a bit, but first let's look deeper into why Prost was so annoyed. So Prost has claimed that the idea for the drivers not to race each other at the start was suggested by Senna. In the Senna versus Prost book, which is interesting because it came out before the Senna film was made, and really that film and the way Prost was portrayed, despite cooperating with the filmmakers, it's made Alain a lot more wary of speaking about the rivalry today. So that's why the book is so interesting. And he said, "We had this agreement 2 or 3 times and it always worked. On the restart, we were first and second. For me, the race was going to start after the corner, so after Tosa. There was no need to take a risk. And then boom, Senna went inside me. I was furious." Joe Ramirez, a long-time McLaren servant who somehow managed to maintain a close relationship with both drivers during this period, said Prost stormed out after the race because he was so hot with anger that he would have said things that he might later have regretted. And he reckons that if Prost had stayed to discuss it there and then, in Ramirez's words, there could have been fists thrown. I have a suspicion that Senna maybe knew something was up, as unprompted, in the press conference, he does offer this slightly limp explanation about having to attack Prost as he was worried about Nigel Mansell's Ferrari close behind them. But Mansell was actually fifth by that point, having not made a very good start. No one else inside McLaren knew about the agreement before the race. Steve Nichols, who was Senna's engineer at the time, said in the book called Alain Prost McLaren, that we've quoted before, that Senna probably used the fact it was a restart as a technical get-out clause, but everyone inside the team accepted that if there was an agreement, Senna should have stuck to it. So Sam, what do you think then? Was there any defence for what Senna did?
Not really in the sense of what you call truth and fairness, but, and sticking to your word. But as we know, such things are not black and white in Formula One, are they? Especially at that level. I think it just shows how ruthless Senna was. But you had to be Prost's teammate, and to get one over Alain Prost, you had to be ruthless. And Senna evidenced that. Remember that this is the same driver, Senna, who, when he was presented with the overhead images of the Suzuka 1990 shunt, he refuted them, basically saying, they must be fakes or they must have been tampered with. He was in a different reality, his own reality. And I think the early evidence of that was this technical get out, as Steve Nichols very purported it very well, I think. And I think in hindsight, and since Senna's untimely death, it's this perception has metamorphosed into a sort of deity stroke legend. And the reality was he was obviously an exceptional racing driver, but he was a real ruthless operator. And I think this is a case study in how ruthless he could be. That's not to say that you should love him or remember him any less for it. Absolutely not. But let's look at the facts. He would do anything to win, and that included occasionally bending the truth or out and out cheating, which he did at Suzuka a year later, didn't he? So it's complex. I think in Senna's mind, he had this narrative. It wound Prost up. And I think actually the fact that Prost's race fell apart at Imola kind of was almost a byproduct of what Senna, the bigger picture that Senna was forming at that stage, knowing that the team wasn't big enough for both of them, and that he had to deploy certain tactics to make sure that if the team wasn't big enough for both of them, then he was the one who was going to maximize that space in the team, and Prost would have to look elsewhere. And I think really that's what we saw in this early incident of controversy between the two of them.
We should point out that as Sam mentioned earlier, there was a backdrop of simmering tension between the two already. And often Senna's swerve towards Prost at Estoril in 1988 is considered the trigger for this rivalry getting out of hand. But Prost has said on several occasions that while that moment was on the limit, they were fine with each other once they'd spoken about it. But as we talked about a bit in our France 1989 episode, where Prost announced he was leaving McLaren, he was also upset with what he felt was preferential treatment Senna was getting from Honda and from the team, as Senna was allowed to spend most of the winter in Brazil while Prost did all the testing. Word of the fallout didn't break immediately, and things were still yet to get totally out of hand by the Sunday night. In the week after Imola, Senna and Prost were testing at Pembrey in Wales, and whenever I hear this story, I love the idea of the best F1 team in the world doing its testing there. And Ron Dennis turned up to this test by helicopter. Ron didn't normally attend a test like this, so everybody there knew something was up. Ron took both drivers into the truck that was on site, although I've also seen it described as a caravan, firstly to find out what on earth was going on, but also to read the drivers the riot act. So let's hear Ron's account of what happened, and this is from the Sky Sports Ayrton Senna special that ran in 2014 to commemorate 20 years since his death.
They started to argue almost like two petulant children, really. I mean, I was looking at them thinking, this behaviour isn't befitting, and I lost it a little bit, and I ramped the pressure, and they still didn't get it, that effectively the team had to come first. It just had to understand the team had to come first. We gave them equality. Their behaviour had to be consistent with the values of the team. In the end, I pushed so hard, I tipped them into a very, very emotional state. They didn't look like anything other than very frightened children at the time. But I think the consequences were, again, they reached for their respective national press. It fueled it. I mean, it was smouldering after the race, but I had it in control, and then it got really fueled.
In Prost's account of this meeting, he has said a few times that Senna accepted there was an agreement, but he then accused Prost of overtaking him. In the Senna versus Prost book, Prost said, "Ron said to Ayrton, we have to fix the problem we had on Sunday. Ayrton offered all kinds of excuses. Ron was not taken by this. Then Ayrton started to cry. He had lied. He was convinced he was right. Maybe he cried because he realised he was wrong and he lost his honour." Senna was forced to apologise to Prost, which he was not happy about at all. And crucially, it was agreed that what went on in that meeting would never be spoken about to anyone else. And that's where we're going to come to shortly. So, Ed, hearing what Ron has said there and Prost's account of it, what do you make of how Ron tried to handle this and tried to get it back under control?
I think it's to his credit, he tried to manage the situation and was happy to address it head on. Perhaps it was a little bit theatrical, helicoptering in, made it all very obvious, and it clearly didn't work very well. It's very tempting to cast Ron Dennis as the scolding schoolmaster fanning the flames, but I think ultimately it was out of his hands. You've got two all-time great drivers, both have the Force of Will of champions. They're both, by this stage, in the mindset of this team isn't big enough for the two of us. So I don't think you can do anything, really, to prevent that happening. I don't doubt he could have done things a little bit better. And as he put it, ramping up the pressure and getting angry probably didn't really help matters. But I think even if he'd done the impossible and extinguished the flames, it would have just reignited some other way. Something else would have happened. Those two were on a collision course, quite literally, as it turned out. And I'm not convinced that any human being or deity, for that matter, could have prevented it.
And the drama, as we've hinted at, doesn't end there. What happened next was something that Prost admits was a huge mistake. Prost told a French journalist he was close friends with about the meeting. He said it was all off the record and that he couldn't tell him many details, but one thing he did give away was that Senna cried. Now, despite that chat being off the record, the journalist then wrote the story, which ran in L'Equipe in France, and it even included quotes from Prost, including a line where he said, "At a level of technical discussion, I shall not close the door completely, but for the rest, I no longer wish to have any business with him. I appreciate honesty, and he is not honest." Senna found out about this, and now he was the one that was furious. In the Sky Sports special about Senna, Joe Ramirez said Senna told him, "I don't want to hear anything about that French guy. He has called me things in the press that I don't deserve. He should say it to my face, but he doesn't. He says it in the press." And even in public, actually, Senna would tell the media that they were finished. Ramirez added in the Senna versus Prost book that the L'Equipe story was the end of their relationship. Joe said, "It wasn't pleasant. After this, Ayrton never called Prost by his name again. He would only refer to Alain as him or worse." McLaren insiders reckon that beyond an occasional hello, the Pembrey discussion was the last time Senna and Prost had a proper conversation with each other. Amazingly, by the time they got to the Monaco Grand Prix, the next race, Prost didn't know about the L'Equipe article. He said in the Senna versus Prost book that Senna was ignoring him in Monaco and he had no idea why. Prost said, "We just had this strange ambience. Then someone told me about a story, the story about the meeting in Pembrey had been published in L'Equipe. I had not seen it myself, and when I did see the story, it was really nothing. But I was furious with the writer, and he told me he made a mistake. Ayrton and me had many problems, but I could not expect one of the worst to come in this way." So, Sam, Prost obviously had a large element of trust with his closest allies in the French media, but to go back on the agreement not to tell anyone about this discussion, how big an error was this from Prost? And was Senna within his rights to feel so aggrieved?
Yeah, it was all getting a bit playground at this stage, wasn't it? I'm not entirely convinced it was an error from Prost. You know, he says he didn't know about the L'Equipe piece. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I'm pretty certain that the author of that feature was Johnny Reeve, who was a seasoned and respected journalist and with a big publication with L'Equipe. And he was on the inner sanctum of the Prost camp. So for Alain to describe its publication as a mistake, it just feels a bit flimsy that he didn't think that was going to be published, or he had some agreement with Reeve that it wouldn't be published. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a ploy and an effort to get an equaliser over Senna for what happened at Imola. I mean, it's unsubstantiated, but that, if you looked at it a certain way, that's what it could feel like. This seemed to do initially as Ayrton completely had ignored his teammate in Monaco. It seemed to backfire spectacularly because Senna then went out and completely destroyed Prost in every single session at Monaco. I mean, including taking pole by 1.1 seconds. So I suppose the kind of what you call the key lesson from that was, don't wind Senna up to that extent, because he did thrive on conflict, as Prost said himself in that season. It was also a crucial time in the McLaren camp as well. And Monaco was the first time that Prost met with Cesare Fiorio to talk about the future. So I think that was quite key as well. Imola was obviously the trigger for that to happen to that extent. So I guess the lesson here, like I said, was that don't wind up the guy in the yellow helmet. And that's what Prost seemed to have done. Now, whether that was by design or whether that was by Prost taking his eye off the ball and not realising, I don't know. I tend to think that it could have been the former. Should Senna have been aggrieved? Yes, in that context, in isolation. But of course, this was episode after episode, all within the period of 2 weeks between Imola and Monaco. Absolutely fascinating period of F1. But again, I just think it was just never going to work out between them. And once it went, which was with that agreement at Imola, it was just pouring bucket after bucket of petrol onto a fire, and it was never going to get extinguished.
Yeah, and I must say that we obviously won't drift too far into what happened at Monaco, but there was lots more coverage that when we do a Monaco 89 episode, we'll pick up this story again. But you've probably noticed that up to this point, we still haven't really given Senna's side of the Imola agreement. So let's now get to that in full, because in a brilliant twist, Senna decided to tell all to the French newspaper Prost had leaked the initial Pembrey story to in the first place. So this is what Senna said in, of all places, L'Equipe. He said, last year at Imola, so 1988, Prost had suggested that we should not attack each other on the first bend of a Grand Prix. It was his idea. I had never found myself in this kind of situation before, and I said, okay. We respected this agreement for several races. Then, as our relationship deteriorated, we stopped doing so. This year, after the winter break, we were on more friendly terms. Then came Imola. I remembered the agreement of the previous year, and I put the question to myself, what should we do about the first bend? Alain replied to me, the same as 88. So that was the situation. On the first start, there was no problem. I was in front. On the second, after Berger's accident, he got off to a better start than me, but I got in his slipstream and accelerated quickly. I was going faster than him. Then I started the manoeuvre to overtake him. Not at the first corner, before that. It was when we were braking that we were not allowed to attack each other. We had a momentary confrontation and then I drove clear. The original idea was simple, no overtaking as we braked on the first bend. After the race, I had a clear conscience. I didn't think that the whole thing would take on such proportions. So, Ed, there's the loophole that Senna was clinging to at the time. What do you think of that version of events?
It does sound gloriously disingenuous, doesn't it? It's like we've got this agreement, but there's all these sorts of technicalities. When did it start the move? It's got the idea of the two of them charging down towards the first contested braking zone corner, shall we put it, consulting their list of what circumstances they can do.
The small print.
Exactly. It just doesn't ring true. He's looking for technicalities and get-outs, isn't he? And I imagine it was the same with the idea that was suggested that maybe he also claimed internally that because it was a restart, it didn't apply. These are technical arguments, aren't they? And I have no doubt he knew he wasn't in the right, or perhaps even he convinced himself he was in the right. He was a very single-minded character. But it's just part of the ruthlessness that Sam referenced. So I kind of get where Senna's coming from, but I don't really buy his side of the story on this. And clearly, ethically, as far as we can tell from all the evidence, Senna was in the wrong. But in a way, I quite like the fact he's done it, and I quite like the fact he's trying to defend it, because there's this whole wider context of these two are trying to basically make the team their own, aren't they? So it's all part of that wider landscape.
So just finally, let's have our final say and try and give a verdict on this. So taking in the whole saga around Imola 89, including the fallout, so what Senna did, and then the fallout from Prost going to the French press, without looking at the rest of their relationship, how would you both apportion blame across the two drivers for what we now consider the total breakdown of this relationship? So Sam, you can go first. How would you split it up?
I think they have to take equal blame to a great extent, because they were both, I mean, they weren't rookies. It wasn't the case of Hamilton coming in 2007, fresh from the junior formula, and working his way into a team and understanding how things work. This was two, at that time, reasonably seasoned top performers. So they have to take some element of the blame here. I think actually there's a great claim for Imola 89 being one of the most seismic moments in F1 history, and the kind of butterfly effect of how things went on there. There are two narratives that I think are remarkable. Firstly, the terminal damage to the relationship between Senna and Prost, and it accelerated this feud that was always coming and caused Prost to realise he could not continue in the same team as Senna. In terms of blame, the spark was ignited by Senna, but the situation was so naturally combustible anyway that pretty much anything would have set it off. I don't think Prost handled it that well for such a seasoned professional, as I mentioned, but he was put in an impossible situation as soon as Senna made that decision to grab the line into Tosa. I think it's genuinely a shared split in terms of blame for this dream team to die in the way that it did. But the second narrative, which is interesting too, I think includes the most extraordinary and quite spooky twist of fate as well, which is a kind of backstory to it. But if you think about it, that Prost and Senna feud wouldn't have happened at that time, or would have been delayed. It would have happened, as we've all talked about, at some stage, but it wouldn't have happened then had it not been for Berger's shunt. And I spoke to Gerhard about this in 2014, and he told me the most extraordinary story, which was that 3 or 4 months after the Imola race, there was a tyre test at the same track, and he and Senna, on Ayrton's insistence, walked up to Tamburello to see what could be changed and if the runoff could be pushed back for safety reasons. Because there'd already been those shunts at PK in 87, and then there'd be other ones, obviously, coming in the 90s. They both looked at the wall, peered over it, and saw the river, the Santerno River, which ran behind it. And they looked at each other and kind of shrugged and thought, oh, well, there's nothing we can do. And they returned to the pits and carried on testing. When you think about that and you process all that, and then you jump forward 4.5 years, and everything that happened between Senna and Prost and that incredible rivalry, it just gives you a bit of a shudder, doesn't it? And I think it's just a remarkable part of Formula One history in terms of the intensity. And ultimately, when you look back at it, and I'm sure when Alain looks back at it with the blanket of time, like you could say, that he would probably think, yes, we both could have handled things much better. And they both had to apportion a bit of the blame towards themselves too.
It's a good point about the river at Imola, because I'd heard about that when they changed Tamburello to a chicane. And then when I first went there to watch the 2001 San Marino Grand Prix, I did, in the days before Google Earth, it wasn't easy to find out how close that river was. And I thought I've got to go and see the Senna stuff that's on the barrier, behind the barrier, the kind of memorial stuff that's there. But I also wanted to see just how close that river was, kind of in a way of, come on, they must have been able to do something. And it is, unfortunately, really close. So, Ed, Sam says equal blame. And I think in the end, we got to the point there where that was 45% Senna, 45% Prost, and 10% Berger for having the crash. How are you breaking it down?
I broadly agree with what Sam said. I might make it 60-40 Senna Prost, in that Senna did a few more of the trigger points, but boy, did Prost start to run with him when he could, with what he said to the press, etc. And so, yeah, I think both had a very significant stake in it. Both could have mitigated it, but I think this was certainly the point where neither really wanted to ease it. It was effectively in terms of the McLaren driver, a fight for there only to be one man left standing in that team. So, of course, Senna prevailed from that perspective. So, yeah, a fraction more blame on Senna, but ultimately, Prost would only have been happy if he had a nice compliant number 2 teammate, I imagine, anyway. So, yeah, both clearly have a stake. And these are the battles that you want to see in Formula One. Just because I give Senna a tiny bit more blame doesn't stand really as a criticism. It's all part of the game.
Yeah, and it's brilliant. And Formula One got a lot out of this rivalry in terms of exposure and audience growth. That's it for Imola 89 then. Hopefully, for those of you who didn't know some of the backstory to the Senna-Prost rivalry, we've put a bit more meat on the bones for you. We'll get to the other big Senna-Prost controversies in future series. I am asked about them quite regularly by some of our listeners, but we felt it was important to go back to what kicked it all off in the first place before we get our hands dirty on the 2 Suzuka collisions. And Sam and Ed have both mentioned there that this was all about the drivers pushing for supremacy within the team and trying to make it effectively a one-man team. It was only sort of 3 or 4 months later that Prost decided to leave McLaren and went public with that. And we have discussed that already in our France 89 episode, which you can find back in our feed. So if you do want to take the story on a little bit and you've not listened to all of our episodes yet, go and find that one, because there was a lot more that Alain revealed around that time as well. Remember to get your questions in for our series finale using the hashtag BringBackV10s on Twitter, or emailing bringbackv10s@the-race.com. Or you can leave us a 5-star podcast review if you think we deserve it, and submit a question there too. And remember to check out the Race Members Club, where among the many special benefits available, you will also get early access to ad-free versions of the new series of Bring Back V10s. To find out more, go to the-race.com/members club. Next time, we're jumping forward into the 21st century and taking a look at the 2004 Monaco Grand Prix, where Ferrari tasted defeat for the first time that season, and Jarno Trulli famously took the only win of his F1 career.